Hello, my beloved Econ students. We're back yet again to talk about a different crisis. This time we're talking about the Great Depression. Last time we met, virtually speaking, of course, we talked about the Panic of 1893 and how it didn't last very long, partly because I think of how the government handled it. And again, it wasn't that the government did nothing. It was that the government attacked very specifically the problems with the Great Depression. Beyond that, they said, we're going to let the economy do what it does, which is kind of fix itself and align itself and get back on track on its own. And so, very different story between that and the Great Depression. And I think one of the reasons why the Great Depression lasted well more than a decade, partly because of that particular attitude. So, the first thing, though, we have to understand is what caused the Great Depression. A lot of misunderstandings about what causes the Great Depression. If you ask the average person what caused the Great Depression, the most likely answer you would get would be the stock market crash. Now, it's not that the stock market crash wasn't significant, but I would look at the stock market crash as more of a symptom of an underlying problem, or maybe you could look at it as the first domino to fall, okay, as a series of dominoes falls and then creates. So again, I wouldn't say it was the root problem. I think the root problem goes back to the inflation of the 20s, which is what we're going to talk about, and one of the byproducts of that was an inflated stock market, or a stock bubble, if you want to call it that bursts and then begins this process of the downward spiral. So let's go back and talk about what I think is the best way of characterizing the cause of this, and that is the inflation of the 1920s, which causes the deflation of the 1930s. Now, this is not new to you, because if you remember last unit, we talked about inflation and deflation. And we talked about how deflation is much worse than inflation. Deflation is when the economy is suffering, but deflation is caused by inflation. Okay, now remember the analogy that I used, and again, I know it doesn't make any sense to you right now, but it will someday, where I said inflation is like the drinking binge. Remember those adult beverages that I told you about that you were like, what are you talking about? Yeah, so inflation is like the drinking binge. And when that's going on, remember, life's a party. Think back to the 1920s. What was the nickname of the 1920s? The Roaring Twenties, right? It was one big party. Why? Because money was inflating. As long as people have money in their pockets, they're happy, and life's a party. And so the stock market is exploding. People are making money. People are employed. People are working. Everyone's doing great, right? The problem is, that ends up creating the next day, which is the hangover or the deflation when the economy is struggling, okay? So what happens in the 1920s? The money supply increases by 63% in the 20s. Now again, you might be saying, well, how can money just appear and disappear? But remember, again, I think it was last year when we talked about the money multiplier and how a lot of the money that's being spent in our economy does not actually exist. It's not that hard to imagine that money can kind of appear out of nowhere and then disappear just as quickly, because that's what happens, right? And so what happens is the money supply increases, and also remember, this is tying in a bunch of things we've already learned here. When the money supply increases, interest rates are lower. Okay, so a couple things happen because of that. Number one, this causes people to borrow more than they can feasibly handle. Okay, with lower interest rates, everyone says, ooh, I want to buy a big old house right now, or I want to buy that fancy car that I've always wanted, or I want to do all these things, go on this vacation, and I'll borrow money to do it because interest rates are so low. Money is very cheap. Okay, so people are buying things more than they can actually afford. That's part of it. Businesses expand. Businesses think to themselves, ooh, the economy's doing well. Everybody's spending, so let's build that new factory. Let's build that new line. Let's take advantage of all the spending and this and that. But the reality is the economy can't sustain this, and businesses are expanding, and there's going to be this glut, this surplus of things on the market that now can't get bought. And bottom line is people buy things they don't need or more than they need, and so you get this. And stocks are included in this. The stock market was exploding. Nobody wants to be left behind. So one of the biggest mistakes that people make, this is important, in the 1920s, is because no one wants to get left behind on the stock market, right? So what people were doing is they were actually going to banks and borrowing money and putting it in the stock market. Now that's a bad idea, right? Because if you borrow money and you can't pay it back, at least if you borrow money to, say, buy a home or buy a car or something tangible like that, if you can't pay it back, the bank can at least take your home and have something to show for it. They can take your car and sell it and recoup some of the money they've given you. You borrow money and you put it in the stock market, and the stock market tanks, and all of a sudden what you bought is worthless. There's nothing to recoup. There's nothing to pay back the banks with, right? And so all of a sudden you have this stock market bubble that's created because no one wants to get left behind. You see your neighbor, he invested in the stock market. Now he's got a hot girlfriend and a brand new car, and well, you want all those things too, right? So you go and borrow money, and so banks are getting into trouble with this. Banks were taking deposits, and instead of just loaning it out, they were putting it in the stock market because stocks were so hot. There were a lot of mistakes made in the 1920s. All of it, though, funnels into or can be categorized as inflation. Everything was getting overly inflated in the 1920s. And then, of course, what happens? Eventually, the music stops and the party's over and the bubbles burst and the deflation sets in. And again, you could say the stock market crash was the first domino to fall here, but there are a number of things going on, but really you can characterize it as the deflation. So what is deflation? Deflation is when the economy is coming back down to a more reasonable level. Now, this process, as we know, of course, is not pleasant. The economy trying to get rid of some of the mistakes and deal with some of the mistakes that were made over the last decade, the economy is trying to get rid of that. That means some businesses are going to go under because the businesses were not being run very efficiently or very effectively. That means that some people are going to lose their jobs because jobs simply were not sustainable. That means that people that bought all these homes that they can't afford, they're going to lose those homes, right? This whole process is not very fun, but that's what happens. So people lose jobs, they get pay cuts, or they work fewer hours. As a result, many loans are defaulted on. All that money that you borrowed from the bank, you can't pay it back. Okay, the next thing that starts happening is banks fail, right? Because now all these people, they can't afford to pay back their bank, and the banks are giving out all this money, and then this is where you get in the runs on the bank and this and that. And so people go demand their money, and banks start failing. And as banks fail, of course, now a lot of money disappears because of the money multiplier. It's not just the $10,000 in that bank. It's the $100,000 that would have been created and spent because of the money multiplier. All of that disappears. And so you have rapid deflation. So from 1929 to 1932, the money supply contracted by 1/3. 1/3 of our money just disappeared in the thin air. A lot of that is because banks failing and businesses going under and this and that. So that was really the best way of characterizing the cause of it. Now, what did the government do about it? Of course, Herbert Hoover, he's president when the thing starts. And here's the interesting thing about Hoover. He's given this moniker, this notion that he did nothing about the Depression. That's actually not very true. In fact, I would almost go so far as to say Hoover did more than any other president had prior to him to try to deal with the particular crisis. Okay, he really did do a number of things, getting involved in the economy, trying to help things out. I would say the problem is most of the things he did were mistakes. Okay, so let's dive into that. And so, again, I want to be clear about this. Certainly the Depression was not FDR's fault. FDR inherited a mess. Okay, Hoover also did not cause the Great Depression. He just did not handle it very well. So let's look at these things. So first, one of the first things Hoover did is keep wages and prices high. Okay, now when you keep wages and prices high, here's the problem. Remember, people don't have money to spend. So if you keep prices high, now businesses have all this surplus that can't get sold because people aren't spending it, right? If you keep wages high, people are going to lose their jobs, right? Because now businesses, they don't have the money, people aren't spending, they don't have the money, so they can't afford to keep everybody. So what you really need to have happen to try to keep it, this is an oversimplified look at it, but essentially what happens is this. On the one hand, you have the money supply. On the other hand, you have prices in the economy. That includes wages. Here's what happens. The money supply contracts, right? That's what we said happened. The money supply deflates. Now, there's a period where prices don't adjust immediately. It takes time for prices to start coming down. Now, this period here where there's this gap between the money supply that's disappeared but prices remaining high, that's when life really, really stinks, okay? Because the money's not there, but the prices remain high. So you can't buy, you can't continue to hire. What we need to have happen is for these wages and prices to come down. Now here's the thing, if that happened instantaneously, if 20% of the money disappeared, but prices, every price in the economy automatically went down by 20%, it would be like nothing happened, right? So you go to the store, so yes, you get 20% less in your paycheck, but you go to the store and prices are 20% less, it would be a wash. It would be like nothing happened. What we're waiting for is that adjustment to take place. By forcing wages and prices to stay high, you prolong that adjustment that needs to take place with these wages and prices coming down so that things equilibrate again. And so that was one of the first mistakes he made. Like it says, prevents the economy from making the adjustment, keeps wages high, so unemployment stays high, and when you keep prices high, businesses have these unsellable surpluses, okay? So that was a problem. Probably his biggest mistake was letter B here, the Hawley-Smoot tariff, one of the biggest tariffs in American history. Now, the philosophy behind a tariff is this. It's pretty simple. Hoover's hoping that by raising the price of foreign goods, it will encourage Americans to buy more American goods. And again, in theory, that helps America, right? Because America, we can, buy more things, and then more people are hired, and this and that. The problem with this is other countries aren't too happy about the fact that we are raising tariffs on them. Think about what's happened over the last couple of years with China. As President Trump has raised tariffs on China, what has China done in retaliation? They've raised tariffs on our products, and there are farmers and there's other industries that are not doing well because China's not buying our stuff anymore because they raised tariffs on our stuff, and then it kind of kills our market, and this is exactly what happened. So it's this huge tariff on foreign goods, or these tariffs, and it sets off a tariff war. Other countries put tariffs on our goods, and our overseas markets declines by 2/3 over that 4-year period. Okay, so here's the problem. Americans aren't buying American goods now because we're in a recession or depression, whatever you want to call it, and now other countries stop buying our goods. We have a real problem on our hands. But he's not done. Before he leaves office, he passes the Revenue Act of 1932, the biggest single tax increase in American history, effectively doubled the income tax rate. Now, why did Hoover do this? Well, because he had to pay for all the businesses and all the other people that he was subsidizing during this process. Bottom line is the government needed money. Here's the problem with this. Remember what we learned about fiscal policy. When we're in recession, does the government want to raise taxes or lower taxes? That's right, they should be lowering taxes, because by lowering taxes, you're putting more money in people's pockets, and then people have that money to spend and maybe keep businesses afloat and this and that. By raising taxes, basically what little money Americans had left, the government takes the rest of it, and now we have a big, big mess on our hands. So again, to be fair to FDR, he did not create the Depression. He did not cause it to get worse necessarily. He inherited a bad situation. Okay, now, you question whether or not FDR actually made it better, but he inherited a bad situation. I think that's a fair way of looking at it. So Hoover gets done, FDR comes into office. Now, one of the first things FDR does, well, he does a lot of things. Oh my gosh, we could spend, an entire course on just FDR's policies. But one of the first things FDR does is he takes us off the gold standard. Now, let me talk about the gold standard a little bit, because there's a lot of confusion about the gold standard. So what is a gold standard? A gold standard means that our money is backed by gold. Okay, so every dollar the government prints, the government has a dollar worth of gold somewhere. Okay, New York Federal Reserve or Fort Knox or somewhere the government's got a stash of gold to back up all the money that's been printed. Now, most people think of that as, or why that would give value to money, they would say, well, you're backing money with something of value. Here's what doesn't make sense about that. Gold in and of itself is purely a medium of exchange. When you're hungry, you don't want a piece of gold, you want food. When you're cold, you don't want a piece of gold, you want a coat or a blanket. Okay, when you're bored, you don't want a piece of gold, you want a movie ticket or a vacation or something along these lines, right? So gold is nothing more than a medium of exchange. It doesn't make sense to back a medium of exchange with another medium of exchange and say that that gives it value. What a gold standard does in giving the currency value is it limits the government's ability to print a bunch of money. Okay, this is important, so try to follow this. So again, if you know the government can't print any more money than they have in gold to back it up, it's not that the gold itself gives the money value, it's that people have confidence in the money because they know the government can't go and just print a bunch of money and make it worthless. Kind of like, think about, if you remember your history, what Germany did in the 1920s to pay off all their war debt. They basically ran printing presses nonstop 24 hours a day and got to the point where the German money, marks, became almost for practical purposes, it became worthless. So if you had money saved up in a bank, or if you had money here, basically the government took that money and made it worthless. Now, if the government can't do that because it's backed by gold, that gives people confidence in the money. So, that being said, FDR takes us off the gold standard. If the purpose of a gold standard is to prevent the government from printing too much money, and FDR takes us off the gold standard, what do you think he intends to do? That's right, go to the head of the class. He intends to print money. Now, why does he do this? Well, the government needs money. And they learned their lesson from Hoover, right? What did Hoover do when he needed money? He taxed more. That didn't go well for him, either economically or politically. So FDR says, all right, we need money. We're not going to tax because that didn't go well for Hoover. Let's just print more money. Here's the thing about it. The end result is pretty much the same. When you really think about it, when the government taxes more of your money, when the government takes more money from you, what happens? You have less money to spend. You can't buy as many things. What happens when the government prints a bunch of money? Your money becomes less valuable, prices go up, and you can't buy as many things. It's really the same process. That's kind of like, if you want to think of it, a hidden tax. And so FDR takes us off the gold standard. Fun fact though, I should have mentioned this, even though FDR takes us off the gold standard, he pinky promises the nation, but we're still going to not print any more money than we have in gold to back it up. Okay, it's just not official, but we're still going to hold to this policy. Now, it was interestingly Nixon, of all people, that finally kind of confessed to the world in the 70s, yeah, we don't have all the gold to back up this money. Okay, I think it was pretty clear by that point with the money in circulation, there's no way we had this much gold. By that point, it didn't matter so much because people had lost this notion of gold is what money is or value, whatever else. And so as long as people have confidence in the money, it doesn't have to be backed by anything. And that's kind of where we live right now in this world. But anyway, that was a long story, I apologize, but there's a lot of misconceptions about a gold standard, and I wanted to make that clear. Bottom line is, he wanted to print a bunch of money, okay, in order to pay for some of the things he was doing. Now, I used to, a long time ago when I taught this course, take you through all of FDR's little alphabet agencies, the AAA and the CCC and the PWA and the WPA and the NIRA and all these things, the TVA, thank you, that's good to know. And kind of evaluate each one, what they did, were they worthwhile or not, were they beneficial. I don't do that anymore, okay? That's a long story. I'm just going to hope that you got that in U.S. history at some point. Let me just summarize all of them. I could say it this way. Some were good. Some did legitimate things and were beneficial to the economy. Some were just kind of whatever, not good or bad. Some were kind of disastrous. But the lasting legacy of the Great Depression are these alphabet agencies, this bureaucracy that's created, whereas now the government is more involved in the economy than ever before. And I think we've said this before, once the government gets involved, it's really hard to get them out. Okay, I give you a quick example. I don't want to rail too much on this, but I remember finding out, I don't want to name names, I'm not going to go into this, but basically there was someone who was very wealthy who was getting a lot of money from the government because of a provision that was passed under the Agricultural Adjustment Act back in the 1930s. This guy that is a millionaire was getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from the government every year because of provisions with the AAA. Again, it's just one of those things that it tends to linger. Again, I probably shouldn't name names publicly, but again, that's just how it goes. So, that being said, in my opinion, what ended the Great Depression? Now, a long time ago, you used to be taught that FDR and his New Deal is what got us out of the Great Depression. You really don't hear that much anymore. Statistics really don't bear that out. So for example, the lowest point of the Depression, remember this undulation, the business cycle? The lowest point, the trough of the Depression was in 1937. That was 5 years into New Deal policies. And in fact, as late as 1939, unemployment was still in the 20%. Now, if that's a recovery, that's one of the slowest, worst recoveries I've ever heard of, okay? So most people, at one point you were taught it was the New Deal. You really don't hear people saying that anymore. What you're gonna hear, if you go to college and you take a course in US history, 90% of the time the professor's probably gonna tell you that it was the Great Depression, it was World War II that got us out of the Great Depression. Now, that's a theory. Okay, here's one of the problems that I have with that theory. Okay, think about what was happening during World War II. We were taking scarce resources, turning them into things that are going to be destroyed, literally sending them to another continent and destroying them. Now, that doesn't sound like economic progress to me. Taking our scarce resources, to give you examples, think of what life was like during World War II. Butter, sugar, meat, steel, metal, were all rationed. You're only allowed a certain amount of these things every week or every month. That doesn't sound like prosperity to me, okay? It's not a good thing to take our resources, especially our most valuable resource, our young men and women, and send them to other countries to die, okay? By that logic, we would want to say that that's good for an economy. By that logic, we would want to be at war all the time. People sometimes say the same thing about natural disasters. They say, well, Hurricane Katrina, that was good because all these businesses and homes and whatever were destroyed, and think of the jobs that were created because of that, right? Because now there's all this rebuilding that has to be done. Well, by that logic, we would hope that a natural disaster wipes out the entire nation. Think of the work to be done. If every single home and factory and business in America was destroyed, we'd be not, right? That's not prosperity, though. So I have some problems with that. Now, unemployment went way down. That's easy, though, right? The government can just draft everybody into the army and unemployment would be zero, but then what would we eat? And where would we live? And what would we drive if everyone's overseas fighting, right? And so I have some problems with that. And again, there's debate about this. I would say, though, for my money, the real recovery took place after World War II, after the GIs got back and after we were at peace and after the government stopped spending all their money on these things that were going to be destroyed and we were back to producing civilian goods and actually producing real wealth, goods and services for the economy that can be used and consumed. And so if anything, you could say that maybe there were factories created during World War II to make tanks or airplanes or jeeps or things like that that are now used to make civilian goods, or that there were skills and technology that was introduced because of the war that could be producing consumer goods. But for that logic, you would say that the real recovery takes place after World War II is over and everyone comes back and now the economy can finally start moving again. And so I just have a problem with that. Again, there's debate out there, though. There's people that could probably offer arguments in favor of war. Again, Keynesians especially love war because what happens during war? Lots of spending, right? Keynesians would say spending, spend, spend, spend. So they love wars because there's lots of spending and the government's getting involved and all that. Again, I just don't like the idea of taking our valuable resources and turning them into things that are going to be destroyed. That doesn't seem like prosperity or a good idea to me. So anyway, there's debate about what ended the Depression. Like I say, mostly you're not going to hear anymore that FDR's New Deal because there's just the statistics do not bear that out. So that's the Great Depression. The next time we meet, we're going to talk about the more recent housing crisis that happened in the early mid-2000s, and we'll go from there. And of course, till next time, behave yourselves and stay happy and healthy.